All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. We're so glad you could join us today for our webinar, Navigating Legal Manufacturer Changes and Key Considerations. I'm Gay Esser, the Marketing Manager at RegDesk. And at RegDesk, we're an AI-powered regulatory information management platform with built-in regulatory intelligence. Our platform allows RA teams to leverage AI so you can prepare, manage, and publish international submissions smarter and faster. To focus on you for a minute, I just want to say welcome, and we're really glad you're here. You have so many ways you can spend your time, so we appreciate you spending your time with us today. And we encourage you to participate and ask questions. Just drop them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll save the last 5 to 10 minutes to go through those questions and answer anything that you may have. We'll also share the slide deck, and we'll share the presentation after this, so be on the lookout for that in the next couple of days. We have the privilege of having Jodi Granger here with us today. She's at RegDesk and she's the Director of Regulatory Affairs. Jodi brings over 37 years of experience in quality and regulatory roles within the medical device and IVD industry. She has held leadership roles overseeing global regulatory teams and driving the development and execution of regulatory strategies for all classes of medical devices worldwide. So let's go ahead and get started with our webinar on navigating legal manufacturer changes and key considerations. Thanks so much for joining us today, Jodi. We'll go ahead and get started with you.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everyone. I hope you find this webinar useful. Again, as Gay mentioned, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A chat. We will get to those at the end of the presentation. If we do run out of time where we can't get to all those questions, we will answer them after the meeting when we send the slide deck out. So today we're going to talk about what is a legal manufacturing change. That terminology isn't used in every country, but most regulatory professionals have certainly dealt with that over their career. We'll walk through what are the common reasons for legal manufacturing changes. And then we'll get into the meat of the webinar, which is really what are the key considerations that you need to look at for scoping a project. How do you scope the change? How do you assess the impact and build your plan and execute that plan? We'll also talk about a common problem with these types of projects, which is scope creep. And we'll walk through key takeaways and then, of course, talk about the Q&A. So let's jump right in. So a legal manufacturer is the manufacturer who is responsible ultimately for the product design, manufacture, packaging, and performance of the product. It's typically represented by the name and address that appears on the ISO symbol that I have here on the slide. This entity is who is responsible for the compliance and applicable regulatory requirements. So even if you're not physically making the product, you can still be considered the legal manufacturer. So the next slide kind of walks through the differences between a legal manufacturer versus a physical manufacturing location and a contract manufacturer. It's important to understand the distinctions between these so that you know what the responsibilities are for each entity. So as I mentioned, a legal manufacturer really has the overall responsibility for compliance and regulatory requirements of the device itself. And you would need to have the legal manufacturer represented on the labeling. For a physical manufacturer, that entity is usually the site that is actually producing the product. It's the facility where the device is made, but they do not necessarily have the legal manufacturer responsibilities for compliance. They are making the product according to the legal manufacturer's specifications. You can have a legal manufacturer and physical manufacturer actually be the same site. You could hold both responsibilities. So it's important to understand that distinction as well. A contract manufacturer is a third party that manufactures the device on behalf of another company. So it is the physical location where it's made. So some examples of these different types of manufacturers is For legal manufacturer, company A, that's who is listed on the label. That is who is responsible for the registration of the device and working with the regulatory authorities. A physical manufacturer may be a site in China or another country that molds the device housing and might only manufacture a piece of the product. A contract manufacturer is a facility that may assemble the entire finished device, and that may include the packaging and sterilization as well. So those are the different types of manufacturers that you should become familiar with. A legal manufacturer change can happen due to a number of different reasons, and we face this on a regular basis in the regulatory space. If there is a merger or acquisition where a parent company buys a smaller company and they want to integrate those products into their organization, that would prompt potentially a legal manufacturing change because they are going to assume responsibility for the compliance of that product. You may also face this issue if there are spin-offs or divestitures. We've seen a number of medical device companies that have a whole portfolio of products, and they've decided to take a small piece of that portfolio and sell it off to another company. Once that sale is in effect, then that new company needs to ensure that they execute the legal manufacturing change on their end. They're going to need to change it to their new company name and responsibilities, et cetera. You may also, it's less common, but you may also come into legal manufacturing changes if there's a rebranding or a name change. You know, maybe the company was set up with a certain brand in mind, a certain focus for the company, and now they've decided that they want to change that branding. And so they've decided that the company's legal name will change, and that will prompt this activity as well. Or there may be a consolidation of legal entities where you have multiple divisions and maybe they are currently under different legal manufacturer names. They want to consolidate all of those as one entity moving forward. So those are the typical reasons for a legal manufacturing change. So the key considerations for scoping the product is you first have to define the type of change that you're moving forward with. Is this a name change only where it's a branding issue, or is it a full legal entity change? The reason you want to make that distinction is that there may be different actions that need to occur, both from a legal perspective and a regulatory perspective with that distinction. You also, in terms of scoping, need to identify the full list of product families and SKUs that are going to be affected. It's very important to have that list accurate as you're moving into the scoping phase. You also need to determine where all of those SKUs or products are being sold currently. You need to map each SKU to each country, and you need to understand what regulatory approvals are in place. It's important to note that products may be split onto different licenses or registration approvals differently from one country to another. One example of this is that some countries allow you to register not only your primary device, but also your accessories under one license, even if those products are a different class or intended use. Other countries would require two separate registrations, one for the primary device and one for the accessories. So it's important that you get down to the granularity of detail for your existing licenses, because that may impact your strategy on how you're going to move forward with making this change on your entire portfolio. You also need to understand any renewal obligations that are upcoming. So licenses in many countries expire, and you have to initiate renewal activities in time so that there's not a lapse in your approval. Depending on the timing of those renewal applications, that may impact how you're able to roll in a legal manufacturing change. So it's really important to map out those details during the scoping phase. In terms of a legal manufacturing change, there is always labeling changes impacted here. So the legal manufacturer, as I mentioned before, needs to appear on the labeling, and it's typically near that symbol that I had in the previous slide. So you need to identify the complete list of all impacted labels that will need to be changed. This will include your inner labels, outer labels, and shelf cartons. The device itself, if it is a reusable instrument and it happens to have branding or other information that could be impacted by a legal entity change, you'll need to identify that as well. Your instructions for use will change. Your software UI may change. Promotional and sales pieces also would potentially need to be updated. So it's important to map out all of that labeling that could be affected. And with that, each piece that is changing, you need to determine what is going to change on that piece of labeling. Is it only going to be the legal manufacturer next to the symbol? Or are you also going to have a new EU representative? Is your country of origin going to change because the legal manufacturer, perhaps it used to be in the United States, is now going to be in Mexico, or vice versa? And any other labeling changes that you identify as part of the scope of this project will need to be mapped out in this first phase. With this mapping process, it will allow you to conduct inventory planning for all of your labeling components. As you can imagine, if you have a whole portfolio of products that you're making this change to, you could have hundreds of labels that are impacted, and you need a plan for being able to utilize your existing stock under the current legal manufacturer and then be prepared to cut everything over. Normally, when you cut over, you're going to want to cut over all of those various elements of labeling at the same time. You are not going to want a box label and a product label or a pouch label to conflict with information. So aligning all of that takes a great deal of planning and ensuring that you have that cutover really mapped out well and effectively. There's also manufacturing changes that you need to consider. Sometimes with a legal manufacturing change, especially if you've acquired another company and you're going to now bring their portfolio of products into the corporate entity, there is a physical manufacturing site change at the same time. It's very common for both to occur at once. So that will prompt you to have a whole additional scope of work for this project. You need to determine, are there any product specifications that are going to change as a result of this shift? You may want to shift suppliers. So if you're purchasing at the current legal manufacturer, your pouches and boxes from a particular vendor, now that you're consolidating and you're bringing the product to your corporate office, you have vendors already in place for pouches and boxes. And so you may be converting to new suppliers on key components. So it's important to understand that going into this planning process. You also have to determine if it's going to be a new physical site change, physical manufacturing site change, what validations are going to be required. You may need sterilization validation repeated. your molding validations or packaging validations. You'll have to plan out whether IQ, OQ, PQ is required for your equipment that you're transferring from the existing manufacturing site to the new one. Your device master records will need to be in place at the new site, as well as updates to your design history file. So if it's an acquisition and you've acquired these design history files, part of the process to bringing over to corporate, sometimes a decision has to be made. Are we going to keep the design history file in the format of the predecessor legal manufacturer, or as part of this effort, we're going to bring them in line with our procedures at the corporate level? So all of those decisions need to be made and documented so that it's clear during an audit what you did, why you did it, for auditing purposes. You'll also potentially have manufacturing process flowchart changes. Sometimes when you're bringing a whole portfolio into another entity, it makes sense for process improvement to maybe change the way the flow of the product moves through the production line. If you are making changes, then each of those will need to be assessed for regulatory impact. And of course, the validations will need to support that change in your process flow. One other area that sometimes gets difficult is if your customer-facing SKUs or part numbers are going to change. That's a critical decision to make because many registrations are specific to part number. And so if you're deciding that you're going to change those part numbers as part of this, you'll need to identify what the new part numbers are. Sometimes it's difficult, to manage inventory if you keep the part numbers the same. But companies do that simply because customers are used to ordering that specific SKU, they're used to the numbering format, etc. Other times, a manufacturer may decide to change it simply so it's a very clear cutover from when the product was made over in building A versus building B. So that's a decision that's going to have to be made early on in this process in order to prepare. You also have other functions that are impacted by a legal manufacturing change. So there could be supply chain and logistics issues that you need to identify. Your shipping documentation, especially if your country of origin has changed, may need to be updated or modified. You may have to update your approved supplier list. If you're going to retain the original legal manufacturer suppliers for your components, you're going to need to make sure that all of those suppliers appear on the approved supplier list for the new site. You also may have updates to custom declarations or trade compliance information that's needed. So basically, you just need to walk through your whole supply chain and logistics process and understand which of the elements within these processes may need to be updated as a result of the legal manufacturing change. In addition, there are post-market systems that may need to be revised or touched as part of this project. Your complaint handling and vigilance reporting systems, your field safety corrective action procedures, your recall and field action procedures would need to at least be assessed to see if any changes need to be made. When you're acquiring a whole portfolio of products, not all of those product types, classifications, etc., may be already in your existing quality management system. So that's why you need to walk through each of these areas to ensure that you aren't missing anything and that you're able to ensure that the product that's being revised or changed is actually covered by your quality management system. So with that in mind, you may need updates to your ISO 13485 or MDSAP certificates. If your current certificates, as an example, have never manufactured a blood pressure cuff, you need to make sure that those product types are reflected in the scope of those certificates. And that may prompt a regulatory audit in order to make those changes. Regulatory audits certainly need to be planned and timed accordingly, and that could significantly impact your project plan timing. So it's important to understand from a quality system what needs to be modified. You also have a lot of quality agreements that might be in place, quality agreements with suppliers, quality agreements with distributors or customers. And if the legal entity is being changed, then those documents also need to be changed. So that's a lot of work depending on how large of a portfolio you're modifying. It's a lot of work that needs to be coordinated and executed. Once the scope of the project is completed and you're really sure that you've identified everything that's going to be changing, that is where your regulatory assessments come into place. Each of the countries where you currently market the product are going to need that full scope of change laid out for them so that they can determine whether submissions are going to be required for this. I will say from my experience that legal manufacturing changes on labeling is normally significant, and most countries will require you to resubmit, and they'll all have different timing for approval for that process. So you develop the thorough list of changes, you send them to the regulatory person who is supposed to assess for that country. Sometimes it is, you might have entities in each country that are part of your own organization that can do those assessments. Other times, if you sell through a distributor network and they own the licenses, then it's the distributor that's going to have to do that impact assessment. You want to ask them what the timing is for approval. You want to ask them what documents are required in order for them to submit. If they need validations that are completed, then the timing for those submissions will obviously need to happen once those documents are available. That gets tricky in terms of if you need European approval, as an example, in order to submit, that's a predecessor, you need a declaration of conformity, then you have to make sure that you stagger the rest of world submission until you have that European approval in place. So having that full list of documents that are required for submission by country is important. You also need to ask if there are restrictions for importing inventory manufactured under the prior legal manufacturer. If you are building inventory to support this transition phase, some countries will allow you, they'll give you a grace period, and they will allow you to continue to import under the prior legal manufacturer with the prior legal manufacturing labeling, but other countries do not. So it's important to ask each of those countries that are doing this assessment for you what the restrictions are for inventory so that you can plan accordingly. In terms of the next phase is really building the project plan. So now you've scoped the project, you understand these are all the changes that I've identified for, not only the product itself, but our quality management system, our supply chain, et cetera. You've scoped everything out. You've determined your regulatory impact. Now you can build your project plan, because based on that, especially the regulatory feedback, that may determine for you how you want to structure the project as a whole. So change controls will be required to, initiate the changes for these products. If you initiate a change control for the whole project at one time, it's going to be very challenging if you have a large portfolio, because the timing for when you can implement the changes is going to vary so much, not only from product to product because of potential validations, but also from a regulatory approval perspective. So I recommend that you look at that and maybe have smaller change controls initiated based on product family. I found that to be the most successful way to get through a large portfolio change, especially because you've got to manage not only the validations that might be required, but also all of the labeling updates and coordinate the timing of each of those levels of labeling at the same time. So you can make decisions when you're pulling this project plan together on how many change controls you're going to need and how you're going to divide that work up between them. You also need a cutover plan for all of your components and finished devices. So as I mentioned before, you may be changing suppliers for some of your components. So you'll need that cutover plan. And on your finished devices, if there are restrictions in countries where you're unable to import product with the old labeling after you've gained approval, as an example, then you're going to need to make sure that you manage that cutover plan to ensure inventory availability. The regulatory submissions, of course, there'll be a plan developed for that, but approvals will vary. There's an estimate of approval time that may change based on questions that you receive from regulatory bodies. So it's important to ensure you've got enough cushion in your plan to kind of account for the things that are going to be outside of your control. One additional thing I'll mention that I forgot to mention on this building the project plan. Legal manufacturing changes, especially for entire portfolios, are very complex projects. They involve literally almost every function in an organization, and they involve a lot of moving pieces at one time. You need a highly skilled project manager to coordinate these efforts. You do not want someone leading these projects that does not have a lot of experience managing complex programs and really understanding the dependencies between the work that needs to be done, by R&D and operations versus the work needing to be done by your labeling teams and your regulatory teams, and even your supply chain folks. So I strongly recommend that if you are initiating a legal manufacturing type of effort in your organization, that your selection of a project manager will be critical. It will determine the success or failure of your project. If you don't have folks in-house with that expertise, then I suggest you find an external resource to help with that and make sure that you're truly vetting them to ensure that they too have the type of experience that is needed. In terms of inventory, this is an area that often it becomes a critical issue and often gets to be the biggest pain point in legal manufacturing changes. You have to forecast the product that needs to be built at your existing legal manufacturer, so that, especially if you're transferring equipment, once you transfer that equipment from site A to site B, you're no longer going to be able to physically make product at your original site. So you need to make sure that you understand how much product you have to build before you make those equipment moves to ensure that you can still keep supplying your customers. You also, on the other end, your plant B, your new manufacturing location, if there are delays in validation, delays in obtaining the labeling that is required to produce product, if there are regulatory delays, all of that could impact how much inventory gets used. And the biggest concern organizations will really have is what happens if we run out of product and our customers can no longer purchase while we're making this transition. Customers will, of course, if they need product to treat patients and yours is not available, they're going to have to seek competitive devices. So it's really important to understand these inventory builds for each country that you're currently marketing in. Make sure that you've got enough cushion in there to protect yourself and ensure that you can continue to supply. You also will need a communication strategy, not only to external partners like distributors, your economic operators, and regulatory bodies, but also to internal stakeholders as well. As I mentioned, these projects are highly complex and they impact a lot of people at one time. Business isn't stopping just because this project is ongoing. So it's important to understand what you need to communicate both internally and externally and when. In terms of the execution of the plan, as I mentioned, these types of changes involve involvement from most functions in an organization to some level. So it's important that each group be accountable for their specific tasks and work items to ensure timely reporting to the project manager of all of their deliverables. A shift in one function's deliverables can have huge impact on the rest of the work downstream, especially when it comes to your regulatory submissions. If we've mapped out a plan, as an example, for the timing of the submission to a particular country, and that gets delayed by a number of months, there might be a renewal that kind of falls within that gap that needs to be addressed. And so some regulatory plans would have said, well, we won't initiate a renewal because we're going to instead file for this legal manufacturing change and then gain approval for the new site. But if in fact things are delayed, that renewal might become a requirement in order to keep supplying your product to your customers. So it's important that all functions for their deliverables, as I mentioned, really be accountable to their deadlines and accountable for reporting any risk involved in missing those deadlines up to the project manager so that the rest of the teams can determine what that delay is going to mean for them and if any strategies need to be adjusted. This is, again, where having a very seasoned project manager will become critical because you're going to be juggling a lot of balls at once, a lot of moving parts, and it can really impact the success of the project itself. One area that I want to touch on as part of this call is scope creep. So as I mentioned before, business initiatives are still happening while this project is in flight. Many legal manufacturing changes take a year to go from the start to the end or more, depending on how large of a portfolio you're making this change on. So those business initiatives may be happening, and many times you'll end up having the project manager or a particular function getting a phone call that says, hey, we're in the middle of trying to make this change. I want to change, the packaging design, or I want to implement an EIFU where we had paper before. I mean, it can be a whole host of other initiatives that your organization is trying to execute, and it will impact your product. So they want to say, well, can we combine the two changes, your current change control as well as this add-on that we want to also do? Can we combine them in the effort? And sometimes, yes, the answer will be that you can make those combinations without impacting your overall legal manufacturing plan. But in other cases, it's really not feasible. So those are the hard choices that you might have to make through this process. And you need to understand who the decision makers are to make those choices along the way. If you don't have clear understanding of who's going to be able to decide what gets thrown in as a scope change or not, you're going to experience a lot of delays, confusion, frustration among your staff. So definitely make sure that you have a group of decision makers identified for this type of activity. I've never personally gone through a legal manufacturing change for an organization that did not have these issues come up. It will happen. So plan ahead, be prepared, and make sure that you're ultimately successful in getting those decisions made. Ultimately, the goal is to ensure that customers can continue to get your product. If your plan was not prepared properly, thoroughly, and have realistic timelines, then there may come a point where you don't have inventory from the original legal manufacturing site available to sell, and you're not ready yet to release product being manufactured at the new facility, then that's ultimately going to be the biggest risk to the organization. So ensure everyone keeps the goal in mind of making sure that your customers are impacted in the least amount possible during this type of a change initiative. So key takeaways that we have is really ensuring a thorough scope is developed. So we need to make sure all of the changes are considered. Changes for your product itself, your specifications, all of the labeling changes that would be required. And that's on every element of labeling, not just what's on your box or your pouch, but your IFUs, your software, the device itself, if it requires some kind of marking, your promotional materials, etc. Make sure all of that is captured in the scope change. What business processes need to change? As I mentioned, you may have supply chain processes, importation paperwork, your customer service information, your product, catalogs, etc. All of that needs to be looked at and determined if changes are required. Certainly, regulatory impact is a big piece of these changes, and your quality management system as well. Ensuring that the timelines that you create are realistic and account for some kind of safety factor will be very important. If you try to create a schedule that is too aggressive and not realistic for how long it's going to take to get each of the tasks done, then your project will fail. You've got to make your best decisions as you go through each of these tasks, but I just caution you to ensure that you're realistic in those estimates so that your inventory plan and build really reflects what you're going to need at the end of the day. And I know we talked about scope creep at the end here. Try to minimize that as much as possible. I know that business initiatives need to happen, but that scope creep, each time someone wants to add something into the mix in terms of a change, you should really look at it as, is this going to significantly impact my timeline? And if it does, do I have enough time to accommodate for extra inventory builds or replanning my cutover timing for labeling, et cetera? Really make sure you understand what the impact is. If ultimately you need to add that change in, at least you understand what the ultimate impact that you decided is acceptable is going to be. That's all that I have in terms of slides.
Well, perfect. Thanks so much, Jodi. That was such valuable information. And again, everyone, I sincerely apologize for whatever that error and glitch was. We will try to merge everything together and send you out the replay. And now we're going to go through some questions. So hopefully this will answer some things. There were a few more questions that when we had the glitch, it kicked them out. So if you could resubmit your questions, that would be great. Keith, I know was reading one of yours that was pretty in-depth between what was going on between US and EU. So if you could resubmit that, that would be great. And I'll start with this one. Another question about a comparison between US and EU. Is there a difference between the legal manufacturer and private label distributor in the US and EU?
So the regulatory responsibility is really what defines a legal manufacturer. Who is ultimately responsible for that product being in compliance to the regulator? Who is the regulator going to audit and say, yes, you've developed, manufactured, sterilized, sold this product in a compliant way? So the term legal manufacturer isn't used by every country, but that's really the distinction. If you forget about the terminology and you just focus on the requirements, and the one slide that you'll get really kind of maps out the differences of what qualifies someone as a legal manufacturer, I think that table will help you.
Okay, and another question is, in your experience, is it possible for the notified body to approve the change in address of a legal manufacturer, but allow the old LM address to be maintained on labels until the rest of the world approvals are gained? This company is specifically looking into making a change at the moment. The PM will stay the same. Most countries will not allow modified labels to be imported into the countries prior to approval being gained, but will also require updated ISO, CE, and DOC to be provided in their submissions to initiate. So are you able to answer that for us?
Yes, I can. In my experience, no. Once you have approval with the notified body for the legal manufacturing change, they're going to expect that any product that you produced from that day forward, essentially you might have a very small window of a transition plan, but any product that you're producing from that point forward will contain the new legal manufacturing information. So that's where your inventory planning comes into place, because Europe will likely be one of the first countries that you seek approval of this change. And that's a predecessor document that you may need for a lot of different countries. So that's where your inventory planning comes into play. You're going to want to build up inventory of your existing manufacturing site so that you can bridge the gap between the two. And it's hard to do. It's really hard to manage and plan for that inventory because all of the regulatory approvals and requirements vary country to country.
All right, so keep your questions coming in. We have a little bit more time. So another question, how far in advance should we begin planning a legal manufacturing change?
You really should initiate activities 6 to 12 months ahead of execution. These projects are a very wide breadth. So in order, you saw the elements that I mentioned that you really have to consider in order to get all those inputs on what needs to change, how is it going to change, how long is it going to take us to change. It really takes time to pull that together well. And then once you start the execution phase, it can take, up to, depending on your validations, it can take up to a year to really get through to the point where you can actually start submitting to the various countries. It's a long process, especially if you have a very large portfolio.
Okay, perfect. Hopefully this is starting to answer some of your questions, but if you have additional ones, please continue to ask. Another question, Jodi, is what are key considerations when changing a contract manufacturer inside the U.S. market?
If you're changing a contract manufacturer inside the U.S. market, and they are not the legal manufacturer, another entity, your company, is likely the legal manufacturer. Changing of a contract manufacturer will consist of making sure that the product being made by that new manufacturer continues to meet the specifications that have been established previously and approved by the regulatory bodies. So you'll have to go through, of course, validation efforts and things of that nature, but a contract manufacturer change in and of itself, it is not the same as a legal manufacturing change.
Okay. Is there typically a grace period for selling off stock with the old LM that is already placed in the market?
In some countries, yes. They will give you a grace period. They will allow you to, some of them will say, as long as you've imported it by, the time you get approval for the new one, you can sell that until it's gone. Other countries will say you cannot import, once you've submitted, you cannot import the product with the old address on it. So that's why that regulatory assessment in the beginning is really important, to lay out country by country what the restrictions are and what the grace periods are that they may offer. Some might give you 6 months, some might give you 12 months, some might not care. And they say as long as it was produced under a valid, it was approved previously and it was a valid certificate, then you can go ahead and continue to sell it. So it really varies a lot by country.
Okay, and we have another question on the EU-US comparison. When it comes to a change like labeling, what differences would be in relation to the RA perspective for US FDA and EU CE? During the process, are there items that can be harmonized between both the US and CE when declaring a change to the FDA and notified body?
Yes, I mean, certainly most manufacturers produce products that goes to both US and Europe. It's the same product code. And so harmonizing the content of those labelings is fine. On a legal manufacturing change, however, a lot of times on the US side, it's a lot quicker to get through a legal manufacturing type of change, because if your product hasn't changed in terms of specifications, you might not need to file submissions, where in Europe, your declarations of conformity, a lot of additional things will need to happen, and that takes longer. So some companies choose to create a SKU for the US, do the US first, and then roll in the EU at a later date. But that'll all have to be factored into the plan. And it also will determine, of course, the risk class of your device. That could change the strategy if you're dealing with a class 3 PMA product versus a 510K lesser class of a device.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. Who in the organization typically leads a legal manufacturing change project?
I've seen it done multiple ways. Where I've seen it most successful is that you'll have a project leader that is governing the whole project. So all the functions, tasks, deliverables, and scope of work. And that overall project is being managed by someone highly skilled who knows how to run a project and get things done. But many times, especially on the regulatory piece, they'll ask a regulatory project manager to step in to manage the regulatory side separately. If you have a very skilled regulatory person that you can basically free up for a whole year to work on nothing else, they could be both. They could handle both as well. So it'll really, I don't think function matters as much as skill set.
Okay, what is the most common reason authorities reject illegal manufacturing change?
Let's see. I think the rejection is really more of questions that will come from the regulatory authorities. So if your documentation is not thorough, that will be an issue. If you have tried to justify different changes and not revalidate, as an example, if you've moved equipment and you've decided to do some justification, those are the types of areas that might be challenged. The misalignment between your labeling and your QMS certificates is also, you have to synchronize all of that at the same time. So if you haven't done that, then and it submitted everything in your package to the regulatory authorities that align, they'll question that as well.
Okay, and it looks like we have a couple more, and we'll try to get to them really quickly so we cut out just on time. Do you have experience with an address change only for an existing legal manufacturer? The challenge will be that it needs to be one hard switch for the entire portfolio because we can move in families from an old to a new LM. Does that make sense, or do you need a little more information, or?
Say it to me one more time, Gay.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. Do you have experience with an address change only for an existing legal manufacturer? The challenge will be that it needs to be one hard switch for the entire portfolio because we can move in families from an old to a new LM.
Okay, so with this, I guess a clarifying question I would have is the address change because the post office has updated the address and it's the same physical site, but you need to update the address, or is it truly you're moving from one building, everything over to another building? If you are physically moving the product to another building, and so that address is going to change, then that's going to be really hard to cut everything all at once. It's going to be nearly impossible to do. So whoever asked that question, if you want to give me.
She said same legal entity, but moving the building.
Yeah, moving the building is a big project, a big deal, because you're going to have to revalidate all of your equipment and each product line. And you're not going to be able to execute them all on the same day. And get all your data on the same day and get your submissions done and approvals all done at the same time either. So those are a physical site change combined with a legal manufacturing change are really complex and hard.
Okay, let's do one more question. Is it legal sorry, let me start again. Is it a legal incompliance if a company changes their name and sells medical devices with the old company name because the certificates from the NB are still showing the old company name? Same for other countries where licenses are showing still the old company name and the amendment will take some time to be cleared.
So this I might need to get back to on because it's partly a legal question. So your company name, your entity of your company has changed. So it sounds like it's kind of like a branding name. The physical site of the product is essentially the same, but you haven't updated all of your certificates yet. So I'll have to get back to you when we send the follow-up slides on that one, because I don't want to answer you guys wrong. So let me look at it a little closer.
Okay, so Antia, I'm not sure if I'm saying your name right. She'll get back to you on that and we'll go through that a little bit more in depth. And if you have any additional information you want to provide in here, that would be helpful. Then she can clarify that a little bit more for you. So I think that's it with the questions. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate your time today. We do have a webinar coming up next month on June 25th about managing regulatory audits effectively. So a little bit of a switch and difference. So if you're in the audit world or if you've been audited or are going to be audited, please make sure to register and join us. We'll start advertising for that soon. So if you're on our list, you'll get information on that. And Jodi, thank you again so much for all of your information. You provide such great information in a way that's so easy for everybody to understand and absorb. So we thank you for your time very much. Everybody
Thank
have a
you.
great day. Thank you.
Thank you.